I think a lot of organisations overlook the fact that the negative impact of conflict goes far beyond two people in dispute. It ripples out for a start. So every time you have a conflict, you have other people affected by it more broadly. It lowers morale, it interferes with productivity, and it leaves some people feeling quite disempowered who you wouldn't expect to be. They're not directly involved in the conflict. So there's a cost in terms of motivation, morale, team working. Without a doubt, that's got to be near the top of the list, I think. Other costs include, of course, lost time. Conflicts take a lot of time to manage. If you're a manager trying to deal with a conflict between two other people, or you're in conflict with somebody else yourself, of course it's distracting, stressful. People make more mistakes. And I've seen quite a lot of cases where people choose not to work with an individual because they don't get on with them or because they've had a dispute with them. One of the tragedies is, of course, staff turnover, because people very often, in my experience, people very often don't address a conflict. They feel, if they're in conflict, that perhaps their employer isn't looking after them properly. If the two people have come together and they feel unable to control the conflict, and they can simply leave their jobs. And time and again, both as a mediator and as a consultant, I come across cases where people have left a job or are about to leave a job because of an ongoing conflict. I think any manager in their working career is going to have to deal with conflict, either their own, between themselves and other people, or managing conflict between two other staff members. And so it's a good idea to be comfortable with the idea of dealing with conflict. Now, a lot of managers, a lot of people are very uncomfortable with conflict. They see it as destructive and disruptive. I think a lot of managers are uncomfortable about dealing with conflict because they see it as essentially disruptive and something they don't want to have to deal with. In fact, that's true probably of most of us anyway. It needn't be like that, because actually conflict handled well is an opportunity to strengthen relationships. So I don't think the problem is conflict, which is, after all, inevitable in any working situation. Anytime you bring groups of people together, there is going to be conflict. It's how we manage those conflicts that distinguishes really how well a group functions or not. And if you look at any successful group, including successful families for that matter, any bunch of people who get along well together, they have maybe tacitly agreed, but they have in them agreed methods of dealing with conflict. And so I think the key message really has to be that don't be afraid of conflict. Take a little time to learn how to handle it constructively, because it's an opportunity. Human beings, people, we are a social species. And as a social species, we naturally have to rub along together, and we've evolved to do that. So built into our groups, our systems, our societies, built into us as individuals, we have natural conflict resolving skills. Many people overlook the fact that most of the time on any given day, we rub along with others, we manage to patch up disagreements, avoid misunderstandings, and conflict doesn't erupt. There are a few occasions where it does, and we tend to become overly focused on our failures. And I think there's a lot of mileage in the idea that we think about that which we do well. We've got natural conflict resolving skills. It's really just a question of bringing them out, expanding on them, making them more available to us when we need them. Because what often goes wrong, particularly at work, is pressure, stress, demand, the other things that get in the way. And we momentarily lose our ability to resolve conflicts, or we get drawn into something and the emotion takes over and it flares up and begins to spiral out of control. So the ability to step back and think, hang on a minute, I do know how to do this. Now what's the best way around this? Is always a good starting point. Thinking about conflict in the workplace, I think it's very important, whether one is involved directly or whether it's managing conflict between other people. It's very important to realise that what we're trying to manage is the space between those two people. What I've found is that it's really useful to think of conflict in this way. It's not what we're arguing about that's important, it's how we're going about it. Disputes will occur naturally. There will always be disagreements about many, many things. How we discuss those things is what determines whether we, as it were, go down the wrong route and it becomes a conflict, or we have a more collaborative conversation. So I think it's really important for the two people in dispute to think in terms of, let's put this on the table and work on what's between us. And a good way to start to think about that is to think about the outcomes that both people want. When you externalize the problem like that, when you, as it were, put it on the table or put it in the space between you or put it on a flip chart, it's outside the two protagonists, and it's much less likely that either one is going to feel attacked. So the key way to manage the conflict at this point is to think, okay, what is it we both want? What is it that's up here that we need to discuss in this space here in order to avoid mudslinging and attacking each other? But also because however measured our language and however careful we are, if I am directing my comments directly at the other person about, for example, their behavior, their attendance, their performance, it's going to cause friction. It's more likely to evoke a defensive response. By contrast, if I'm talking metaphorically over here about the problems that lateness or performance or whatever are causing to the organisation and to our relationship, it's much less direct and much less threatening, but it still addresses the problem. Furthermore, it's outcome oriented, so it tends to lead the conversation towards healthier conclusions. And of course, an important aspect to all of this is the question of protecting one's dignity, loss of face or maintaining face. We often don't think about it in Western cultures very much, but it's very, very important that I feel I haven't lost face or that I'm not being attacked, I haven't lost my dignity. So if I'm working in a conflict with another person, most of my effort in the early part of the conversation is aimed at protecting their sense of self, protecting their dignity. I'm less worried about myself, but I really want them to feel that I'm working in their interest as much as I am my own. I think it's always worth remembering that it's very important to protect dignity, to protect both parties in a dispute against loss of face. That means that if I'm involved in a dispute with another person, my first recourse, if you like, that means that if I'm involved in a dispute with another person, early in the process, I'm working hard to protect the dignity of the other person and to demonstrate respect for them and their ideas to reduce the likelihood that they feel attacked. People often ask me, when's the best time to intervene in a dispute? Rule of thumb, the sooner the better. I know that a lot of people are uncomfortable with conflict and many managers cross their fingers and hope it'll go away. The result is that they often leave it too long. And things rumble on and they begin to escalate to a point where actually it becomes much harder to fix. So as a general rule, I'd say sooner rather than later, while the conflict is still a little more malleable. And if in doubt, then ask. You two people seem to be having a little bit of trouble. Do you need some help with this? For example. So sooner is always better than later, before the conflict has escalated and begins to become actually much harder to manage, or those two individuals in dispute actually arrive at a sort of a standoff where they won't communicate well. If that does happen, and you have to broker a conversation, a manager has to broker a conversation between two people in that situation, it's very important to remember that the job of that manager is as a facilitator, not as a fixer. So the important thing is to enable and facilitate conversation between the two disputing parties. The important thing is to enable and facilitate a conversation between the people in dispute, not to wade in and try and fix it for them. In this clip, it's quite easy to see how the process of escalation takes place. We've got two people, each with their own set of needs and pressures, both apparently under a little bit of stress, and creating more stress than they need to between themselves as each tries to defend their position. The senior manager has to get the 10% increase. The guy on the other side wants to protect his troops and make sure that they are looked after. And Mike, by contrast, is more focused on looking after his team. He wants their efforts to be recognised. He wants to protect them from what he sees as unnecessary extra stress and pressure, when they're already doing the best he thinks they can do, giving the most. What happens in this process of escalation is you see the divide growing as the discussion descends into two people defending positions rather than collaborating to discuss the way forward. The result is that it just kind of creeps up without anybody meaning it to. And pretty soon it gets out of control. Emotions are raised and it becomes more heated and actually difficult to come back from. This illustrates a cycle of escalation. Think of it as a cycle. And we may not be able to influence the other person very much, particularly if they're upset, but we can influence our own behavior. So by changing our position, our way of talking, and our approach to the other person, we can actually start to interrupt that cycle. So, for example, rather than pushing for my results, I might show more interest in the other person and, if, as it were, build a relational platform on which to have a slightly harder conversation, slightly tougher. So, for example, rather than pushing to have my position responded to, I could show more interest in the other person and thus build a kind of relational platform, a foundation, if you like, from which we can have a tougher discussion. But unless I do that relationship building early on, there's no sense of trust and the divisions are going to become greater. Clearly, it's a real gift to be able to stand in somebody else's shoes. We hear it all the time, but what does it mean? Well, if we think about another person's resistant behavior as simply them needing to protect some aspect of their working life, their interests, whatever it happens to be, we can then empathize. We can actually see the position from their point of view. It doesn't mean we relinquish our own needs or our own, in this case, need to get production up by 10%. But it does mean that it's likely to create a more convivial atmosphere and one where we're going to... But it does mean we're likely to create a more convivial atmosphere and one where both people are able to talk in a more reasoned and balanced manner. It's always important in conversations which could suddenly spiral out of control to regularly reinforce the message that actually you're looking for a solution. You're looking past the immediacy of the dispute between two people and looking for, as it were, win-win outcomes for both people. So to that end, I like to remind people in dispute regularly of what the outcome we're heading for is. What are we looking for here? And to draw them away from the dispute between two people and get them to focus in a more future-oriented way on just what we're trying to achieve by reminding them regularly, in fact. Part of the reason that defending our positions leads to an escalation in conflict so often is that, in effect, we're stuck in a part of the conversation which is never going to go anywhere. If you are managing a conflict with yourself, between yourself and somebody else, or between others, it's always useful to move the conversation as quickly as possible from positions, I'm right, you're wrong, or I want 10%, you say you can't give it. Those are both positions. To interests. What are the underlying interests behind my demand and your defense of your position? So rather than sticking to positions, move to interests. Perhaps the best way of explaining this is to use the classic orange example. If I say I have an orange, but two people want it, I've only got one orange, Typically, people respond by saying, well, cut it in half, half each. This is a compromise. If, on the other hand, I ask the two individuals, why do you need the orange? What are you going to use it for? I may have an answer from one that they are going to make a cake with the rind, and another one wants the juice because they're thirsty. Or I might get the answer that one of them wants to use the rind to make a cake, and the other wants to drink the juice because they're thirsty. So suddenly we have two different needs out of the apparent simple request to have the orange. So looking for interests beyond positions means finding out what makes the position necessary. It means probably asking more questions rather than jumping to conclusions and fighting over positions. So, left to its own devices, where people are arguing about positions, more than likely it will escalate. And a lot of people say to me, well, that's all well and good, but how do I interrupt this escalation? How do I break the cycle? And I think the first thing is to do is we have to keep control of ourselves and sufficiently grounded to be able to say, oh, stop, this is not going the right way. And I might even say to the other person, can we call a halt for a moment? Seems to me we're headed off in the wrong direction here. Now, to that, they might immediately respond, well, it's all your fault, this, that, and the other. And you just have to take that and say, look, my interest here is in finding a mutually acceptable solution. Should we take a break for 5 minutes or do something to calm down the situation? When emotions are raised, it will not calm down by itself, and frequently you will have to take a break, but always underline it with your best intentions, which are to find a satisfactory conclusion. And always ensure that you remind people that you are talking about how the two of you are going about this conversation. You are not talking about attacking the other person, even though it might seem a little critical. In conflict resolution terms, we talk about separating the person from the problem. The problem might be, in this case, we need to increase production 10%. It is not the problem of Mike, it is a situation the organisation needs to address, and that is our interest, and that is what the problem we're trying to address together is about. It is not about attacking the person. In this clip, we see Mike and Sue firing off each other. So Mike puts forward his defence as he sees it. Sue then cuts him off and comes in with a demand. He then comes back with more defence, more demands, and so on and so forth. And actually, there's not a sense that either one is listening to the other. First rule of conflict resolution, in my view, listening. This seems counterintuitive because we're very keen to put our own views across and to, as it were, win the conversation. And it takes real presence of mind for a manager to be self-aware enough and grounded enough to take a deep breath, recognize when it's not going right, and listen and ask for more information. You'll get there in the end with the demand, the 10%, this, that, and the other, but hopefully it'll be a more collaborative way of going about things. In this clip, we see very clearly how Sue starts out by building an alliance. She doesn't tackle the problem or the question of the 10% straight away. She spends a little time building, as it were, a platform on which to have the subsequent conversation. It's a very important part of the process. It builds trust and it helps set the scene for what's to be discussed later. Once you've built your alliance, you're then in a better place to start to identify interests on both sides. It's far more likely to be a collaborative conversation rather than a trial of wills. Listening and acknowledging are a very important part of the process. So I like to summarise at regular intervals to make sure I've fully understood, and also it sends the message out that I'm listening and the other person, of course, feels more heard. Listening and acknowledging are very important in any process like this. And here we see Sue actually feeding back, giving brief summaries at regular intervals, which is in fact, and here we see Sue feeding back, giving summaries at regular intervals, which lets Mike know that he's actually feeling, which lets Mike know that he's being understood.
I'm going to have to try there's too many breaks. And
Okay, sorry.
Try and get it in one, I'm sorry.
In this clip, we see Sue regularly acknowledging by summarising what she's just heard. And that's a very important part of the process because it tells Mike he's being heard and hopefully makes him feel more included in the conversation. At the end of the conversation, it's useful, as we saw here, to make a summary. What is it you've discussed? What are the points agreed? What is the course of action? Who does what? And there's a question I always like to ask as well, which is, could anything go wrong? What could go wrong? And of course, the other person might say, well, I've agreed, haven't I? This is what I'm going to do. And I will use a phrase like, yes, but I know that once you get out there, it's a busy working office. Maybe real life will get in the way. Is there anything that we need to be aware of to avoid us tripping up or to avoid having a problem later on? We don't want the problem to recur. It may be that nothing will be mentioned, but it's a useful question to ask because quite often it will elicit more information which can actually be taken account of ahead of time. A key part of any manager's job, whether they like it or not, is going to be dealing with conflict. Most managers avoid it, and it causes a lot of trouble. I think it's really useful to simply take a little time. I think it's really useful to take a little time to arm yourself with a few key skills so that suddenly conflict isn't something you are afraid of, something you run away from. It's actually something you're prepared to roll your sleeves up and get in there and help people resolve it. So let's remember that any time we bring a group of people together, particularly in a work situation, conflict will happen. There will be minor disagreements, minor disputes. Some of these will grow up into much bigger disputes, and they can rumble on for weeks, months, or even years. The cost is actually off the scale. It does untold harm. Very often it's below the radar. Organisations aren't fully aware of it, but it shows up in things like turnover, job turnover, absenteeism, poor productivity, low morale. So I think that taking steps in an organisation to actually assess the conflicts that are happening and to equip managers with the skills they need to have what I call adult conversations and head those conflicts off before they become disruptive, before they become damaging, is time and money very well spent. And it actually doesn't take that much to do it because it can be learnt in 10 or 15 minutes. Watching a short training video on dealing with conflict can give some real insights. And as we've shown, there are probably only 3 or 4 key points which one needs to learn to really make a difference to conversations. But skills that are not practiced wither and die. It's no good just watching a video. One has to go away and practice. Practice on the kids, practice on your colleagues. Continue to think about dealing with human interaction productively. Don't wait for conflict to erupt. Watch people on television, see how they deal with conflict. We all know how to do it instinctively and intuitively. The problem is that we often don't because emotions and other things get in the way. However well qualified a manager is technically, what really distinguishes star performers are their interpersonal skills. And a key part of that is managing conflict constructively. Of course, some people would prefer to keep their heads down and hope that the conflict goes away. But a hallmark of effective teams and effective working environments is that they are managed properly and that conflicts are kept to a minimum, and where they do arise, they are dealt with responsively and supportively.